everybody, welcome back to Witchfix. Today, because of my own stupidity, we will be reviewing Rosemary's Baby from 1968, I think, which is a movie I've never seen before, although, much like The Shining, I feel like it's been ripped off enough and parodied enough that everyone kind of knows what happens in it. But I'm watching it today because I went to my Amazon wishlist to see if there was anything in there that I particularly wanted to watch today, and accidentally clicked on the rent standard HD version. So now it's been rented and I have to watch it. But it is like 2 hours long, so I'm worried that because I kind of already know that the shocking twist, it's going to be kind of a boring movie to watch. But we'll see. As I said, I've never seen it before, although I've seen a lot of things that obviously were inspired by it. But we'll get into it, and then we'll see what we make of this film all these years later. Oh boy, fuck me, that was a long movie, right? Okay, so I've just finished watching Rosemary's Baby, and I have some thoughts. It took a really long time to watch because I had to take so many notes because the film is 2.25 hours long, and most of the films that I look at are like 1.5 hours, and that like extra 45 minutes just felt like a lot. Although, to be fair, the film does fill its runtime really well. It didn't seem to really drag at any point. And I did, overall, I would say, enjoy it, aside from a few slightly ridiculous moments, which I'll get into now. I'm just going to trigger warn up front for some pretty serious topics handled in this film, including but not limited to rape, spousal abuse, spousal rape, and gaslighting. Also a trigger warning for gore and suicide, which we'll talk about when we get there, and we'll go into the movie. So what I knew about the plot is literally just that she has a devil baby, and I'd seen in the XX anthology series of like 4 movies, I think. There's one which is called, I think it's called Her Only Living Son, but it's basically a kind of like sequel to Rosemary's Baby, just like a little short where he's in his like teenage years and his mother is like trying to stop him from accepting Satan as his father. So that's basically all I knew about the movie. And it turned out to be a lot more than that. And I think one of the reasons that I was putting off watching it is because I thought it was just going to be another kind of schlocky horror film. Kind of a little bit like Suspiria, where it's like there's a bunch of weird stuff going on and then at the end it's just evil witches and then they all die. But like most good horror films, this isn't really a horror film about witchcraft. It's a film about other things told through the medium of a story about witchcraft. So to start with, we get like 2 minutes of opening credits, which didn't really need to be there. But then we're introduced very quickly to Guy and Rosemary. Although Guy does not introduce Rosemary as Rosemary, he introduces her as Liz, because he appears to be a compulsive liar. They've come to view an apartment, and in the space of like a 10-second conversation, he tells 3 lies. Firstly, that he's a doctor when he's actually an actor. Then he claims to be a more successful actor than he actually is, and Rosemary corrects him and says that he's been in some plays and adverts, whereas he's like talking about like telly and stuff. And then he calls her Liz as well instead of Rosemary. So it seems that he's just lying for no reason. Even if he wanted to lie and say that he had a better job than he did, just to like impress the person who's showing them the apartment, why does he have to lie about his wife's name? So we pretty much off the bat know that Guy is just hugely unreliable, big red flags all round. I do like that his name is Guy though, because he basically could be any guy. He just fulfills this role of the not great husband. But they're being shown around the Bramford building, which is gothic and weird and kind of reminded me of the original Suspiria. Like the dance school there, because it seems like it's been kind of like portioned up really weird, and there's like rooms that you can hear into. Isn't what I'm saying this? Does it really remind me of Suspiria? It kind of reminds me of the second one, Inferno, that weird apartment building. That's probably better. Yeah, the apartment building reminds me of an apartment building. Groundbreaking commentary, Sarah. Anywho, they look around, they're given some talk about how all the apartments have been divided up, and they're told that the old lady who lives in the apartment they're being shown recently went into a coma in hospital and died, and that all of her stuff is still in there and they could probably get it for a song if they wanted to. And they also note that she grew a lot of herbs in there. And I will say that this apartment is my dream home until Mia Farrow ruins it with her fucking modern 1960s aesthetic. Because it has like a load of big old wooden furniture, lots of books, lots of pots of herbs. I'm living for it. They look around. There's some like tiles broken in the hallway. This building seems to be slightly run down. The elevator's a bit weird and clunky. So I guess maybe that's how they can afford it when he's just an actor who's been in some adverts, but I guess maybe that paid really well in the 60s. They have a look around and discover that there is a closet door which is hidden behind like a big armoire, which has recently been moved to stand in front of it, although how an 89-year-old lady moved it is beyond both me and everyone in the movie. I guess there's some explanations. Maybe it was the stress of moving it that caused her to go into a coma. Maybe because she has a son, her son moved it for her, but either way, it's blocking a closet. When the two guys move it, there's just a vacuum cleaner and some towels in there, so, you know, no evil shrines or whatever I was expecting. Having accepted the apartment, deciding to move in, they go and talk to someone who I kind of assumed was their landlord or who they've been staying with, because he said he was sorry to see them go, and he's got them some nice roast lamb. His name's Hutch, and he's kind of, I guess, a family friend. He warns them about the building because it has like a really weird and bad reputation, that there were some fictional criminals that lived there, including the Trench sisters, who were cannibals and ate children, several witchcraft and devil worshippers, including a guy called Makato, who becomes relevant later. But it has like a weird history, but neither one of the sort of newlyweds seems to take this very seriously, despite being ostensibly religious themselves, or at least Rosemary's meant to be Catholic. They kind of brush it off as just like weird urban legendy tales. They then move into the apartment. We get like some moving in montages, and they hear neighbours talking through the wall in their bedroom. So it's pretty clear that that's where like the partition is, and they can hear the people on their floor. When moving all their stuff in, Rosemary does notice that there are now some shelves just loose in the mysterious closet that have been stacked up to one side. So the mysterious closet continues to be mysterious. Guy and Rosemary then christen the apartment in kind of a weirdly long scene of just two people undressing themselves in a very unsexy way. They then hear like weird creaking. So it's kind of like really hammering home this idea that they are not alone and unobserved. Even in their own apartment, they can like hear things from other places. It kind of creates this kind of interesting atmosphere where you know that what is meant to be like the most private space isn't actually private, which is kind of cool. It reminded me a bit of that Hilary Swank movie, The Resident, which is about a guy living in the walls and spying on you. So there we go. We then see the apartment being decorated, i.e. ruined, with white paint, some really hideous wallpaper and like 1960s furniture. Downstairs in the basement doing laundry, Rosemary runs into a woman called Terry, who dumps a lot of info on us very quickly, but she seems very happy, although freaked out by the basement. In fact, she's so freaked out that she and Rosemary agree to do their laundry at the same time from now on, because the basement's creepy as hell. But they like talk to each other. It turns out she's staying with the Castevets, who are a couple who live in like the other half of Rosemary and Guy's apartment. So they're the people they can hear through the wall. She says that she is staying with them because she used to be like a drug addict and was on the streets, and they've taken her in and they're being really nice to her, including giving her a lucky charm, which is a sort of smelly silver ball on a necklace, which she's wearing. And she says that they like treat her like a daughter, and they're really lovely. She also says that Mrs. Castevet used to get herbs from Mrs. Gardenia, who lived in that apartment before Rosemary moved in. Later that night, Rosemary hears a kind of shouting conversation. She hears Mrs. Castevet saying that she doesn't care what Laura Louise says, and that it's impossible to be 100% sure, and in her opinion they shouldn't tell her at all. So based on latter events, it becomes kind of obvious that they're talking about whether or not they should tell Terry something, and based on things that are coming up, Terry does not take it very well. More concerning than this conversation, however, is the chanting they can then hear through the wall. I had to put subtitles on at the beginning of the movie because I was sure that Guy had called her Liz, and I was not sure why. But I still had them on at this point. You can't hear what they're chanting, apparently, because it's not in the subtitles. Later, a different night, or perhaps the same night. Time is weird. Guy and Rosemary are walking home when they see like police gathered around, and it turns out that Terry has thrown herself out of a window, leaving behind a short suicide note that we are not privy to. So clearly, whatever they told her, she did not like. The Castevets then appear. They're basically dressed head to toe in red and pink, which is an odd colour palette. Like Rosemary's colour palette is very much white and yellow. So, colour theory for you. Mr. Castevet immediately claims that Terry was depressed while his wife is having none of it and is very sad about her death. Obviously, this has been carefully orchestrated, nay, planned, because it's pretty clear that these people are untrustworthy. Rosemary, however, does console Mrs. Castevet and tells the cops that that Terry had a brother in the Navy, and nothing comes of that at all, so I don't know why it was mentioned twice. Later on, Rosemary is unable to sleep, and she hears Mrs. Castevet through the wall ranting about Laura Louise being a fucking idiot. I agree. They should not have told Terry anything. And then she hears how they're going to have to start from scratch and how all of this effort was wasted. But all of this is overlaid on just a nun yelling and pointing at some windows that are being bricked up and some girls. And then Rosemary says, I told sister about the windows and she withdrew us from the competition. And that is never explained. But I guess she has just some weird feelings about nuns. Let's move on. Mrs. Castevet then comes round to visit. She kind of is this really nosy woman who's into everything, commenting on the decor, asking how much things cost, going through her mail. She just appears to be one of them like super nosy older ladies. But she does invite Rosemary and Guy over for dinner. Guy is dejected over losing a role to another actor, so they decide to go to the dinner. And during it, the couple seems fine, but like weirdly gauche. The husband's trying to give them like special vodka cocktails and spilling drinks on the floor, talking about travel in this really long, rambling way, where the wife is just loud and screechy and wearing like appallingly bright colours. So it's pretty clear that Rosemary doesn't really want to spend any time with them. Over dinner, they discuss the Pope visiting. It seems like Guy is kind of irreverent because he says that the Pope's refusal to come to somewhere where there is a newspaper strike on is show business because he only cares about being talked about in the papers. The Castevets lap this up. They laugh and say that the Pope pretends to be holy and probably spends huge amounts of money on robes and stuff. It's obscene. Rosemary is very quiet during this discussion and they say that she's clearly offended. She is meant to be Catholic, but we don't really see a lot of like religious stuff from her, just that she's uncomfortable with this conversation. They then flatter Guy over his acting, and while Rosemary and Mrs. Castevet go to do the dishes and talk about how fertile her family is because she has 16 nieces and nephews, Guy and Mr. Castevet retire to a room for a conversation we are not privy to, but when we see them again they are wreathed in cigar smoke and Guy seems troubled, but then also kind of exhilarated and excited by something. So pretty clear they've had a conversation of some kind of nature, which is vague, I'll grant you. Rosemary thinks the Castevets are tacky, and I'm with her, but Guy wants to go back and hear more of Roman's stories. Mr. Castevet is called Roman. I'm not going to say that again, but just remember it for later. But he wants to go hear more of these stories, so he keeps going around there, and Rosemary notices that while they were there were no pictures on the walls, but there were picture hooks and blank spaces where pictures should be, so something is being hidden from them while they were in the Castevets' apartment. Laura Louise and Mrs. Castevet later on come and pay an unannounced visit to Rosemary, and Rosemary just like greets them and is like, oh, hi, nice to meet you. I'm out of sorts because it's the first day of my period. Which seems kind of at odds with her character because she seems very uncomplaining, very meek, like she wouldn't want to talk about these kind of subjects to perfect strangers. But what do I know? It just seemed a bit weird. Mrs. Castevet then gives her this 300-year-old good luck charm and says that it's full of something called tannis root, which apparently smells bad. It clearly makes Rosemary uncomfortable, but she puts it on to be nice. But she's kind of weirded out that this was on Terry's body when she died and was lying in a big old pool of blood. So she instantly puts it away in a drawer in her dresser, despite the fact that Guy says, as she accepted the gift, she should wear it. Guy then gets a good acting role when the guy who previously got it mysteriously goes blind. Which, to Guy's credit, and I don't want to give him a lot of credit because from this point on in the movie he's basically a monster, but he does in this moment look flabbergasted, or at least vaguely uncomfortable with the phone call that he's just received, you know, where he's getting this amazing role, but because someone else has gone blind. So he seems a bit shaken, but quickly brushes it off because he gets to do this role, and he leaves right away, presumably to go talk to the Castevets. We then see that he's getting like more acting offers. Rosemary goes to see Hutch because she's kind of upset about how preoccupied her husband has been with this like new role. And yet when she gets back, he's bought her all these roses and he's very excited, and he says he wants to have a baby with her right away and has picked out the day that he wants to conceive on, which is red flags. As many red flags as there are roses, but she doesn't seem to notice this. Occasionally it's kind of annoying how slow on the uptake Rosemary is. For the most part, I give her a lot of credit. She doesn't really seem to grasp the weird truth of what's going on, but in situations like this, it just seems kind of weird that, oh, my husband's picked out the very night he wishes that we could conceive. I have no follow-up questions. But there we go. They have like a nice romantic dinner, but then Mrs. Castevet comes to the door, but is just bringing them some lovely chocolate mousse, which she calls chocolate mouse because she's weird. So they sit down to eat this chocolate mousse, but Rosemary says that it has a chalky taste, and she isn't that keen on it. Guy kind of kicks off at this and is like, oh, that's really ungrateful, blah, blah, blah. And he doesn't like yell at her, but he does kind of guilt her into wanting to eat it. So while he's momentarily distracted, she scrapes it into a napkin to throw away. However, while she's throwing it away, she begins to feel woozy and starts like falling down. So Guy helps her to bed, and here's where we get to the moment where we realise kind of what the horror of this movie is about. Because he like takes her to bed, and she starts having kind of weird partial hallucinations where she's lying on the bed, but the bed is bobbing in the ocean. And then she's on like a party on a ship, because I guess she feels still unsteady. But he's like taking her clothes off, and there's basically just like a really long dream sequence where she's like on the boat, and she's told that only Catholics can go on the boat, so Hutch can't come on. But then she's also at this like party full of naked people who are like surrounding her, and it's pretty clear that some of this stuff is actually happening, and this is justified when Guy asks Mrs. Castevet, like, is she awake? And she says no, she ate the mousse, she can't see or hear anything, but obviously she didn't eat all of it, so she's still experiencing some of what's going on. And then she loudly exclaims, "This is no dream, this is really happening!" Which is like the worst delivery of a line that I've ever seen in my life. Although if you were asked to say that line in that scenario, I don't know that it could sound anything but stupid. So that was kind of one of the moments that broke my enjoyment of the movie. But up until this point, it's fairly tense. There's a lot of stuff going on. You can kind of read between the lines. And then the next morning, she wakes up and she feels kind of groggy. And she has scratches on her. Oh, and Guy says that he has like jagged nails, and that's why, even though she definitely had a weird dream hallucination that she was having sex with Satan and his clawed hands, his bright red eyes. But he says that he had sex with her while she was unconscious because it was baby making night, and that it was kind of fun in a necrophile kind of way. And Rosemary is obviously disturbed by this, but I feel like if this wasn't in the 1960s, she would immediately pack her bags and leave him, because she would know that this is literally rape and not okay at all. And then the film would be ending here. But as it is, it adds to this kind of creeping horror, because this isn't really a movie about witches stealing a baby. It's about reproductive coercion, in my view, and it's kind of a feminist take. I don't know if that's what I'm reading into it or what was intended, but there is kind of an underlying message here of women being kind of forced into being mothers, but also being ignored, mistreated, and just generally underserved by a medical field peopled mostly by men. So that is generally where the horror seems to come from in the film, at least in my view. So basically, her husband admits that he's raped her, and she has kind of an issue with this, but not as big an issue as I think she would have now. But she does say that she notices he's not looking at her. Obviously something's wrong. She is, however, delighted to find out that she's pregnant only 2 days later, when her period is late. And she contacts the doctor, who says that she's due in June, but he needs more blood from her, which is kind of horror movie talk for something was weird about the first blood you gave us, but I don't want to tell you, so just give us some more, just in case. This doesn't matter though, because she quickly changes doctors, because the Castevets are instantly told that she is pregnant and want her to go to this amazing doctor they know of called Abe Saperstein. I'm going to call him Dr. Abe, because there's a lot of confusing names in this film, but yeah, she goes to this new doctor. He tells her not to read any books about pregnancy or talk to any of her friends. Just do what he says and everything will be fine. Which comes back to my original point about, male doctors not listening to female patients. Rosemary realises she can't sleep very well, so she puts on the good luck charm and continues to wear it, which is kind of weird. I don't know why she did that 180 on it, but I guess just worried about the baby. Her new doctor, Dr. Abe, declines to give her any vitamin tablets, but instead says that Mrs. C is going to make her a special herb drink, which looks like a pint glass of garlic mayonnaise, and that will give her all the nutrients she needs. So this is yet another case of suspicious milk. She does, however, start experiencing pain in her stomach and goes back to the doctor, but he says it's nothing, and to stop reading books because books will just give her dangerous ideas and make her feel ill, because he's a good doctor. She still continues to feel unwell. She gets a new haircut, like a short hairdo, like a pixie cut. And when she says she looks awful because she's like really pale and can't sleep, her husband just blames it on her new haircut because he is a monster. She also begins, like any monstrously pregnant woman, to eat very lightly cooked meat, like basically raw meat. She gets a visit from Hutch, who says that she looks worryingly pale and thin because Hutch is the only good man in this entire movie. He's very worried about her. She says that she can't sleep. As soon as he arrives and starts talking to her, Mr. Castevet randomly turns up at the front door and keeps looking past her like, oh, someone's here. I want you to introduce me to them. So they're introduced and she realizes that Mr. Castevet has pierced ears, which is treated as like this weird discovery, but never mentioned again after this scene. She reveals to poor Hutch that she's taking this special vitamins drink, which includes tannis root as an ingredient. And he says that when he looks at the bit of it that's in the special necklace, that it looks more like a fungus, and he's kind of worried about it. But he says he'll look it up and decides to go. Mr. Castevet says that he's leaving, but he'll see Hutch again. Uh-oh. And then later on, when Hutch is leaving and Guy has returned home and goes to get his stuff, he can't find one of his gloves. Uh-oh. So the witches know that he's a threat and they now have a piece of his personal property. So that's unfortunate. Rosemary continues to be really unwell and she's now like basically bedridden. But Hutch calls and asks her to meet him in town tomorrow, like away from the house, and she agrees. Guy kind of poo-poos this and then instantly vanishes, but after he leaves we hear the Castevet's doorbell. So he's obviously going to tell them like where she's going. The next day, predictably, Hutch does not arrive because he's in a coma now, because witches. And Rosemary is then accosted by Mrs. Castevet, who basically frog marches her straight back home. Like in a nice way, like, oh, we should go home and have tea and stuff, but she's basically being returned to her prison. There's like quite a lot of like kind of paranoia and anxiety ramping up in the movie at this point. Rosemary complains of more pains. It's now shown to be New Year's Eve, and they're spending it with the Castevets and their friends, who are all celebrating the dawn of year one, which is worrying. Rosemary then begins to eat raw livers and is kind of disgusted with herself. Seems to realise that something's very wrong, and so decides to throw a party, excluding the Castevets and everyone else associated with them, and only inviting her like young friends, people who actually care about her, you know, crazy ideas like that. Mrs. Castevet tries to invite herself, but Rosemary remains firm. At the party, people are very concerned for Rosemary because she looks awful, We find out that that guy who went blind is still blind. Rosemary then breaks down and cries because she has been in pain at this point since November. And I have no idea what day it is now, but it's the new year, so quite a while. Her female friends are shocked that she's been in pain for so long. They gather around, they shut Guy out of the kitchen, and they tell her she desperately needs to get a second opinion because her doctor is a quack. Because obviously he is. Get it together, Rosemary. But when she tells Guy in like the aftermath of the party, when everyone's left, that she wants a second opinion, he calls her friends like meddling bitches and says that she has the best medical care possible, that if she wants a second opinion, it will be Dr. Abe who tells them which other doctor to go to. So basically, he won't listen to her. She says that she started making her own drink and hasn't been drinking the Mrs. Castavet's drink for several days. And while they're talking, suddenly she laughs because the pain has finally stopped. And he shakes her and asks her what was in the drink that she made for herself. So he's been very odd. And I feel like she should be, going back to her original doctor, but she doesn't. But she is delighted that this is the first time she has felt the baby move. So I guess it's healthy and fine and she has nothing to worry about, is what I would be saying if this wasn't a horror film. We enter a kind of second golden period for the film, so sort of like when they moved in and everything was fine. They're now decorating the nursery. Rosemary looks a lot healthier and is now visibly pregnant, as opposed to like skinny and very drawn. She also packs her suitcase for going to the hospital. But then she gets a phone call, which says that Hutch, who has been in a coma since he failed to meet her that one time, is now dead. She goes to the funeral and is given a book which was intended to be delivered to her, and he has also sent her a cryptic message, which is that the name is an anagram, and she assumes that he's talking about the title of this book, which is wrapped up in brown paper so she can't see it. Mrs. C calls round to look at the package she's got because she's super nosy, and also to give her a glass of milk and a small piece of cake with green bits in it, which is definitely different to the health-giving drink that she was giving her before. How dare you insinuate that they are the same thing? The book is called All of Them Witches, which is a very to-the-point title. And when she flips through it, Rosemary discovers that they use a fungus called devil's pepper in their rites. She also finds Mercato, one of the previous residents of the building she lives in, who was killed just outside their building by an angry mob. He's in the book, mentioned as well. She uses some Scrabble tiles to try and work out the anagram, but obviously Hutch was not referring to the title of the book, so she makes a bunch of gibberish, and then she decides to try and anagram the name Stephen Mercato, and that is an anagram for Roman castanet. So, castanet? Castavet. Have I been saying castanet this whole... Oh no! Okay, Mr. Castanet, clack, 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 is clearly the son of this dude who was killed for being a Satan-worshipping witch. Understandably, Rosemary's a little bit worried about this. So when Guy returns home, she's put the chain on the door. She reveals to him that Roman Castanet is Mercato's son and shows him the book. And he doesn't deny that that's the case, but says that he probably changed his name just because he's embarrassed that his dad was murdered for being a Satan worshipper. Which I would buy if Guy wasn't possibly the worst man alive. So, there we go. She's very scared about the baby because the book says that Satanists and witches, which are the same thing in the book, want to use the flesh and blood of babies in their rites. So she thinks that they want her child for this reason. Guy then confiscates the book and puts it on a high shelf. Like she is a child who has had too many gummy bears. So he's putting them where she can't reach them, because that's how he treats her, like a naughty child. She goes to see Dr. Abe again, for some reason not connecting him to the Castanets, who introduced her to him. But she tells him all of her worries that they are witches, and he says, don't worry, I'll give you some pills that you can take instead of the health drink, and you can deliver in a hospital. He says that Roman has a few months left to live, and that he will advise him to go travelling, so he won't be around to be a danger. And then Mr. and Mrs. Castanet depart. I'm sure they do. They get in a taxi, so they must have left. Rosemary then tries to find her book on, the high no-no shelf, where parents put things, but Guy's thrown it away, which she's very annoyed about. She then walks through several lanes of traffic and then chucks her protection charm thing into a storm grating to get rid of it, and buys a new book about witchcraft, which says that the coven can do various things with their mental powers, including blinding people, and that sometimes they need a personal object in order to do this. She rings that blind guy who's still blind and talks to him, and manages through a series of kind of leading questions and generally acting clueless to get him to say that he has actually been missing something since he last had drinks with her husband, namely a tie. So it's pretty obvious that her husband stole this tie from him so that they could do a spell on him to make him blind. She takes her hospital suitcase and some cash and goes straight to Dr. Abe. This is the moment, the only thing in the movie where I was like, come on, woman, get it together. Because it's pretty obvious that this guy's also involved, and she should know that. And it was the one moment where her kind of naivety really stretched the believability that I had in the movie. Because up until now I was like, this is totally reasonable. She feels like something's wrong, but she doesn't want to say that something's wrong because it feels like it's irrational. But this is if you know that you should be worried about the castanets, why are you trusting the doctor that they recommended to you, who all your friends told you was a quack? But there you go. She's sitting in the waiting room, waiting for him to finish with a patient so she can talk to him, when the receptionist remarks that she's no longer wearing that weird perfume, and she says, oh no, that was just a lucky charm. Then the receptionist reveals that maybe the doctor has a similar lucky charm because that's what he always smells like as well, and that Rosemary just hasn't noticed because she was wearing the charm the whole time. So this is when she links this concept that, oh my god, that doctor that the witches recommended might be a witch. So she runs away. She gets into a phone booth and calls Dr. Hill, begging him to see her. It's kind of tense because she has to keep waiting for someone to phone her back at the payphone. And then while she's doing so, a man comes and stands outside, but with his back to us. So it kind of looks like Mr. Castanet. And then he goes to the side, and then a different man comes back, who's a stranger. So it seems like it's fine, but there's this definite idea that she is being watched. She goes to Dr. Hill and tells him a bunch of paranoid shit about how her neighbours and husband are witches and they're trying to steal her baby. He tells her to go have a little nap, and she's heartbreakingly happy that he believes her, because he says there's all kinds of crazy people in the city. And she goes to sleep and has a little dream that the baby has been delivered and it's all fine. And then when she wakes up, Dr. Hill has called Dr. Abe the Satanist and her husband the dirtbag, who basically threaten her with commitment. Not like he's going to marry her again, like they're going to put her in a mental hospital. That sentence just sounded weird. They threaten her and get her to go with them. They go home. She drops her purse to create a distraction, rushes into the elevator by herself, gets to the apartment and locks herself in, but goes into labour. And then as she's trying to call friends who are unfortunately out, people start walking past the doorway because there's obviously a secret way into the apartment that isn't the front door that she just locked. And she's then kind of cornered and forcibly sedated. When she wakes up, she appears to have been delivered of the baby and asks if it's okay. She's told that everything is fine. Guy says that they have a happy, healthy baby boy who is definitely not the Antichrist. God, you were weird there for a minute, weren't you, Rosemary? Good things, everything's all okay now. Go back to sleep, honey. And then she wakes up again and asks to see the baby, at which point the amazing Dr. Abe comes in and says there were complications, but they won't affect future births. Which is just the most callous way ever to tell someone that their baby is dead, even though obviously the kid's not dead. It's fine. But basically he blames her for delivering at home when she wanted to deliver in a hospital, but obviously he basically kidnapped her and forced her to be at home. And Guy assures her that as soon as she's healthy again, they can have another baby. And if you've ever watched Call the Midwife, you'll know that this is a pretty, every time they have a male doctor there instead of a nun, he's this mean. He's just like, oh no, don't worry, you can have other kids. What's that? You have postpartum depression? Pop out another baby, that'll cure it. This is that kind of attitude towards, female reproductive health. Just kind of played up, a number of notches, and it is quite horrifying. And I think this, again, contributes to it working really well as a horror film, especially for a female viewer, because you can kind of understand where a lot of Rosemary's fear is coming from. It's coming from the fact that she's largely ignorant about the care that she's receiving. In this case, that care is, witch potions. But, if you look at it as something analogous to, modern experience, you're told to take this and that pill, and they're not going to bother explaining why to a silly little lady, because, she'll just take whatever she's told to take. She doesn't know what's happening to her own body. In this case, she's growing the Antichrist. In normal cases, she's going through all of these changes that she might not be prepared for. So, again, really great horror film. Back to the plot summary. Guy is just being a general tossbag. She accuses them of lying and becomes quite shouty, so they sedate her again because she's at her best when she's asleep, apparently. Guy later says that she went prepartum and had hysteria. The use of the word hysteria, again, feeding into that kind of women's health issues, this large kind of zone of quackery, where you just say that anything that a woman does is just her uterus migrating to her brain and causing problems. He does say that he's about to land a massive movie deal, maybe 2, and that they're going to move to Beverly Hills. So he's excited, they're going to be rich, he's getting everything he ever wanted, and he only had to trade his baby and his wife's sanity for it. Good deal. She asks to see his shoulder because she thinks that there's going to be a witch's mark there, but there isn't. This is the moment in the film where it's trying to do it both ways. It's trying to be oh, these people are witches, but also maybe she's just mad. And just like in a lot of films that try and do that, it's not, because that's never the case, but it is kind of interesting, and this is kind of a moment that we need for her to question herself and question everything that she knows. Later on, she hears a baby crying, although everyone else claims that they can't hear it. She begins hiding her pills and is suspicious when they have her express her milk, which is obviously still there. They take it away and don't want it contaminated by her putting dirty spoons in the jug on the tray. So obviously they're using it for something, and it doesn't take a genius to work out that they're feeding the baby with it. She then continues to hide her pills and then goes for a little walk around at night with a big knife, because you need a big knife. She realises that the secret passage into their apartment is through the mystery cupboard. Had you forgotten about the mystery cupboard? I hadn't. So she goes through there and finds that the pictures in the Castevets' apartment are now back up, and they're all burning churches and weird demony things, which I guess accounts for some of the hallucinations that she was having when she was semi-chocolate moosed into a coma. She finds that the witches have all gathered and are having a weird baby shower. Presents are on a table, everyone is there. The baby is in a gorgeous black bassinet with an upside down cross hanging over it, because subtlety has left the building. But everyone kind of goes silent when she appears with her big knife, and when she goes over to the bassinet and looks into it, expecting to see her baby, she recoils in horror and demands to know what they've done to it and what they've done to its eyes. She's told by a gleeful Mr. Castanet, clack, 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 that he has his father's eyes, as the child is not Guy's, but Satan's. She has borne Satan's heir, and now is the first year of the rest of time. Satan has risen. Everyone starts Satan hailing. Things seem to be getting, a little bit ridiculous, because people just keep going on and on about how, Satan's here, and it's amazing. They're talking about who won the election or something. It's very odd. They've also named the baby Adrian, which is not a very demonic name, but there we go. She then kind of drops the knife and screams, "No, it can't be!" which is the second most ridiculous line delivery in the movie. It feels very, overwrought. And it's kind of when people, drop to their knees and go, "No!" And a lot of the time that comes off as silly. This is that. But there we go. Mr. C declares that God is dead, which is a bold statement, but he's agreeing with a cover of Time magazine that was seen earlier. So I guess this is meant to imply that they have big reach and big influence, more than even she is aware of. Mr. Castanet then takes her aside and asks her to be a real mother to Adrian, which I guess means, they're tired of sedating her all the time and it would really help if she would take care of the child that she didn't want to have, but that they kind of forced on her. So again, there's that kind of reproductive coercion angle. Everyone seems to be expecting her to be normal. They just like park her in a chair and bring her a cup of tea, and they're like, stop making such a fuss. We're having a party. Shush. A guy then comes over and says that he was told that she wouldn't be hurt. And I thought he was maybe going to have a moment where he was sorry, but he just says, they said they wouldn't hurt you. And they haven't. You're basically fine. I don't know why you're making such a big fuss. And she spits in his face, which bloody well right she should. She should also break the teacup and use it to cut his face off, but I guess there isn't time for that in the movie. The baby begins to cry because Laura Louise, whatever her name is rocking him like she's trying to send him into orbit. And then Rosemary goes over there and is like, you're doing that wrong, and begins to rock the crib. The Satanists gather round and they start taking like photos of her, and it kind of feels like a normal baby shower at this point. And the baby stops crying, and then the sort of weird lullaby being sung by Rosemary, which was played over the opening credits, is played over the outgoing credits, which seems to suggest that she has either completely lost her mind or has accepted her role as the Antichrist's mother because, I guess, of just the overwhelming pressure of everyone she knows has just kind of forced her into this role. This idea that if a woman is incapable of like not becoming a mother, she will just adjust to it and accept it as her role, is kind of how I read that ending. So obviously I've interpreted that movie in a way that is quite feminist, quite pro-choice. That's not obviously the only interpretation of it, that's just my reading of it. But I have to say I enjoyed it quite a bit. I was expecting it to be a lot more dated than it was, whereas I think the way that I've interpreted it, the way that I was viewing it, makes it feel a lot more modern. I think there has recently been like a television series adaptation of it that was like 4 episodes, which I understand was poorly received, but actually quite faithful in terms of updating the story. So you can check that out if you're interested. But I think this does read, if you kind of watch it, as a lot more modern than it could have been. It reminds me a bit of Cherry Tree, which is another film that I looked at. If this was to be given like a Suspiria-esque glow up, like a proper film remake, it could be really successful, especially now with like the whole like Me Too movement, the child-free movement. A lot of things could go into that and be explored a little bit further than they were in like the 1960s. I know that this film is based on a book. It's a book that I haven't read and can't comment on, so I don't really plan to read it, but it's out there if you want to. So I really enjoyed it. I don't think it's a great film about witchcraft because you don't really see anything witchy in it. It's just people you're told are Satanists being quite creepy. But you don't, see any rituals or anything. Aside from the black bassinet, everything's basically normal. And I kind of like that because essentially it's not really a film about witchcraft. It's a film about Hollywood's idea of what Satanists are. They just call them witches because to them it's the same thing. But I kind of like the presentation of them as just normal people doing normal things. And although you hear chanting through the wall, there's no like weird schlocky ritual stuff, except for what can be passed off as this hallucinatory dream that she's having. And the way that you don't know who's a Satanist just by looking at them. They're just normal people. Like, it's kind of ambiguous as to whether Dr. Hill himself is involved, because he just kind of calls her husband, and the doctor, does he do that because he doesn't believe her, or does he do that because he's involved as well? So that's quite an interesting idea. So I kind of like it in the sense that it has all these like feminist themes running through it and all of that stuff, but at the end of the day, it's another film where witches are confused with Satanists and kind of wrapped up in this Hollywood schlock horror idea. I think that I like this film more than I liked the original Suspiria because that isn't all there is to it. It's using that kind of witchcraft trope to explore something deeper and more horrifying in a kind of analogy. Whereas I think Suspiria just kind of threw a bunch of like witches and gore at the screen and tried to be scary in that way. So I definitely prefer this movie, and I would totally be up for watching a remake or like a modern updating version of it, because I think that would be really interesting. So if you have been holding off on seeing it because you think, that's an old movie, it's not going to be that scary, it's not going to be that good, it is tense as hell, and I heartily recommend it. It kind of reminds me of the Annabelle movie, but good, so take that for what it's worth. Although, if you are going to watch it, be warned that it's not terribly witchy, beside The Amazing Apartment. And that it is more of a good horror film as opposed to a good film about witches. Now, I've left this to the end on purpose because I wanted to discuss, obviously, the plot of the film and everything first, and to sort of go through it and my reactions to it before I dug into it any further. But it would be remiss to talk about Rosemary's Baby without talking about Roman Polanski. So we're going to get into that now just for a second, because overall I want this to be a review of the movie and not like a hash of Polanski's career and history. Roman Polanski wrote and directed this movie, and it came out in 1968. It wasn't until 1977 that he was arrested for the sexual assault of a 13-year-old child, and later on, through a plea bargain, pled guilty to a charge of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor before fleeing America to France before sentencing and staying there for basically a really long time. I'll include a link to a page with more details, but essentially he is still there. I don't think he's actually been sentenced yet, but there's been various different attempts to extradite him, and obviously with the whole Harvey Weinstein scandal, that got a lot of attention again as well. It is really weird to me that such a film as I've just watched, and that came across to me with such a feminist understanding of what would make a horrifying film about birth and gaslighting and all of this other stuff, could be made by someone who legally has admitted to committing this offence against a 13-year-old child. I think it goes to the idea that you can, on one hand, understand these things and then still go out and commit acts that seem to go against your understanding because you feel like you're exempt, or because you just have that cognitive dissonance where you can see that this is wrong and would make for a good horror film, but also you want to do it, so that makes it fine. I can't really obviously speak to motive on that, but as I said, obviously he pled guilty, so technically it's not really like an allegation anymore, it's confirmed. But I wanted to mention that just because obviously it's kind of an elephant in the room for me to go on about my feminist take on this movie and then to ignore the fact that the person who wrote and directed it was involved in such a case. I don't necessarily agree with it. I've seen some people saying that they wouldn't watch the film or they wouldn't talk about it anymore because of this, but I think that is kind of a disservice to everyone else who worked on it, particularly Mia Farrow, who does an excellent job in the movie. Her acting is really good, and it is kind of a classic of horror, and I think that sometimes you really do need to separate the work from the person it's associated with. Like for me, I still have an immense love of the Harry Potter books, even though even thinking about like J.K. Rowling and some of the things she said that refer to like me and some of the people that I'm really close to make me sick to my stomach. Will I buy future Harry Potter merch? No. Will I go to like Harry Potter theme parks and spend money there? Still no. But I still have those books, and maybe one day I'll be able to reread them and enjoy them. It was still a really big part of my childhood. In the same way, I think that we can look at this film and say it's quite an incredible horror film. It's really nuanced in some ways, like the takes that it has on things. It can be interpreted a lot of different ways, but at the end of the day, it was still made by somebody who I don't think any of us would want to hold up on a pedestal or really think about in any sense of them being great in any way. So I'm sorry again for including this. I know that my movie reviews tend to be mostly quite light-hearted and irreverent because I watch a lot of terrible movies and I do try and be funny with it, which is why I left this to the end, because I don't want to get like too serious right off the bat. But it did feel remiss to not include a discussion of this and to kind of pretend that it didn't really exist. I didn't know a huge amount about it before watching the movie because my knowledge of the movie was spotty and my knowledge of like the people involved in making it was basically non-existent. But it didn't take long to kind of find some of the stuff, and I will include some sources in the description box as well if you'd like to go and do some further reading, and just in case that I've got anything wrong in my reading of facts, I'll put the link down below. It's mostly just the Wikipedia page, which is fairly comprehensive and has a list of sources at the bottom. If you have any other films that you'd like me to accidentally purchase on Amazon and therefore have to watch, do let me know. Get in touch in the usual ways on Twitter. I do occasionally look at the email. Not that much, I will admit. Make sure you check out the Amazon wish list where you can send me things if you would so like me to get to them sooner rather than later. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye!